right, here we go. We're going to start the lesson. The lesson is history repeats itself. So we learned in our last lesson that we're going to go into deep time, this concept of the long and complex history of life on Earth. And we're going to talk about different eras and epochs and what has happened in the past. So buckle up, let us go into our lesson. Here we go. And I would do history repeats itself with a twist first before you do the other lesson. Yeah. Okay. So our introduction. What happens when the average global temperature changes quickly? Climate has always changed. Why are we worried about it now? From corals to ice coverage to atmospheric changes, we've observed a wide variety of drastic and rapid changes across our planet today. We've been able to link these changes to climate change triggered by a warming world. But climate has always changed, right? Should we be worried about it this time? So from our learning objectives, we're going to define, from observation and data, the roles of various components of the atmosphere as they influence climate. And do you remember what atmosphere stood for? Atmos meaning gases, and sphere meaning, or vapors, atmos, vapors, sphere as in the globe. So these are all the gases that are around our globe. We're going to then describe and evaluate patterns of global climate change revealed through data, including the role of natural and anthropogenic processes. Do you remember what anthropogenic means? Anthro means man, and then genic is generated, so human-generated processes. All right, so I'm going to start my notes and title it, date it, write down some of those learning objectives, and then let's dive right in. Okay, so you can see how I'm starting my notes. Sometimes it's important to write down what we're going to learn, so I wrote down those objectives, and then I'm using a system here to show the different vocabulary. So I'm using a different color pen to show different new vocabulary words and then defining them in that different color. Okay, so if we look at Earth's timeline, we have to go deep, deep in time, right? What is our place in time, they're asking? To understand the importance of the changes taking place today, it's necessary to understand changes that have taken place in Earth's past. Let's explore the past. How old do you think the Earth is? Go ahead and enter your guess. If we were in the classroom, we'd do a really fun activity where you'd add up everybody's different guesses and divide and see how close we are as a class. How long do you think the total lifespan of Earth will be? Interesting thing, you could go Wikipedia, the future of Earth. That's a fun little rabbit hole. So you can see here this like loopy picture. It goes all the way Precambrian, and then there's little diagrams that describe, we have trilobites here, these really cool organisms. We start to see in the Paleozoic more ferns, larger lizard-like creatures evolving from making the transition from water to land. Here we have the Mesozoic, we can point out some dinosaurs. Cenozoic, whales, all the way to humans in the last minute of time. Neil deGrasse Tyson does a really great history of the Earth and where we are. If the total history of Earth was just 1 year, then humans would take the last breath here in the last few moments of the year. So go ahead and give your guess there. I'm curious, what do you think? On to the next one. And so how do we know this? How do we make a guess? None of us were alive when that happened, right? I've been here for just a couple decades. You guys, just 1.5 decades. But it's through research in geology, physics, chemistry, and biology that we have been able to reconstruct Earth's past and project some of the major events in Earth's future. Based on the study of stars, we predict that our sun's lifetime will be 10 billion years. Scientists also predict that before the sun's death, it will swell so much that it will engulf Earth. This means Earth's lifespan could be no longer than 10 billion years. We are roughly 4.6 billion years through that lifetime, slightly less than halfway. Okay, and this is a cool graphic, so this is all that's happened. And then this is the future, this blank gray slate. What will happen in that future is the question. Click on each eon of Earth's history on the timeline above to view the dominant life forms. Then characterize what you see. Okay, so we can click on each one of these. The Hadean, big question mark. What do we see? I guess that means unknown. We don't know what happened in the Hadean Eon. That was way back, the first formation of the Earth. Okay, and the reason for this big question mark is the Hadean Eon, named after the Greek god Hades, for the underworld, was categorized by molten surfaces of the Earth. There was volcanism, volcanoes going off, asteroids hitting the Earth, so it was a really catastrophic sort of time, and so we don't really know what was going down. We don't know what kind of life forms were there. Potentially there were not any, because that seems like a pretty harsh environment to live in. All right, the Archaean, what do you notice? What do you think this looks like? It's green. It's maybe multicellular. There's many different cells here. Okay, so from that Archaean eon, we can see there are potentially some life forms that are microscopic. Okay, so we said microscopic, and the Archaean eon is started when there was a transitioning from liquid to solid. So when we first get our first fossil record, or rock, even rock formation at all, that's when the Archaean eon starts. And these are a type of photosynthetic bacteria called stromatolites, and they form around calcium carbonate. And you might remember calcium carbonate if you did the egg lesson on diffusion, but any eggshell, think that's like calcium carbonate, something like limestone. So they built up what they call stromatolites, which are some of the oldest living life forms. They look kind of like this. They're these fun, here's another image of them, these fun little domey shapes. So they are laminar in formation, which means they form in a line. Yeah, and they're pretty cool. You can find them all the way up at the Great Salt Lake, which was my playground for a little bit. A lot of people study these life forms because nowadays they've found in Brazil hold a lot of oil. So of course there is money behind studying how past stromatolites formed by observing present stromatolites. So that's your little background on that one. Okay, back to the lesson. Next eon. All right, and the next picture here for the Proterozoic is marked by the increase in oxygen and the development of more complex. We're still single-celled. You can see that from the picture here. They're still really small, but they're a little bit larger, and you notice that little dot there. That is the nucleus. So now we've entered eukaryotic zone, and this is where Earth is still microscopic, but it's starting to get more complex and more diverse in form. There's also evidence for the increase in oxygen can be seen in the rock layer in what's called the Great Oxidation Event. So there's a layer of red rock. What happens when a car rusts? Rust is a transformation of iron into a form that has been exposed to oxygen. And so we see that same dark red color you'd see in rust in the rock layers. And that's how we know there was an increase in oxygen. All right, now let's learn about the Phanerozoic. Here we go. What do you see from this picture? What do you observe? Okay, and so then finally in the Phanerozoic era, what do you notice here? We see trilobites, it's those cool little guys there, dinosaurs, larger mammals, and this is an eon. It's a huge amount of time, so it can be divided down into different eras. And so you have the Paleozoic, the Mesozoic, and the Cenozoic, and maybe those ring a bell from you, but we start to see macroscopic, bigger organisms like flowering plants, mammals, cone-bearing trees, dinosaurs, like we mentioned. Also during this time period, Pangea, which you may have heard of, this giant landform, is formed and then starts to break apart. All that happens within that one eon. So, like we say, a deep time, lots happening back millions of years. Kind of hard to comprehend when you think about your own life and what happened yesterday, what's going to happen tomorrow. All seems like a big timeline. So, despite Earth's 4.6 billion year age, macroscopic life only emerged about a half a billion years ago. That may sound like a long time, but it's only 13% of Earth's history. The other 87% of Earth's history featured only microscopic life. Ecosystems that we are familiar with are even more recent, representing 1% of Earth's history. Over time, many different ecosystems have come and gone, some gradually, some catastrophically. All right, so if you're really interested in this topic, figuring out the deep time of Earth, and you want some extra credit, I suggest you do this lesson, and I'll post it here soon, but it's called The Universe Beads. It's a mala mandala for the modern era. I adapted this lesson for you, but it comes from this website called Universe Beads, and they're these really super neat beads. I'll show them to you soon, but they look kind of like this. And what you do is you can kinesthetically arrange and model the age of the universe, and all these really big massive events. For example, this right here, that bead represents a eukaryote, like we just mentioned, which happened in which era? That's right, the Proterozoic eon. And you can also see you can see the timeline built out like this. And if you want to, you can buy the beads here, or you can just find beads at the store and be like, okay, I want this really cool bead to represent the oldest spiral galaxy. I want, you can go here, okay, what's going to look like a cyanobacteria, or the first bacteria that can use photosynthesis. Then there's this massive oxygen event. We just learned about that when oxygen became oxygen increased at one point in the atmosphere. And so oxygen is toxic. I don't know if you guys know that. So it's useful in certain quantities, but it can also be toxic for other life forms. So those that it was toxic for died off. And then you have an extinction bead. Chloroplasts, protists, multicellularity, so this is maybe a volvox, we talked about that. Sponges, squishy creatures, shells, first plants, so here we get into the biology of it. And so you can see how these events all happen in relatively newer succession. And you'll get to see that as you build your universe bead chain. So this is a lesson available to you if you want extra credit in this unit, or if you want to do this, I would count this instead of your lab, but you'd have to fill all of this out. Okay, so I'll post that in the announcements for you. Back to our lesson. So the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, it is also known as the PETM. So when and what? The planet has warmed and cooled over time. In this lesson, we will investigate an abrupt warming event that is the closest analog or approximation we have for what is happening on Earth today. This event, known as the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, occurred 55.9 million years ago and separates the Paleocene epoch from the Eocene epoch, seen the timeline below. Okay, so an epoch is a period of time. Multiple epochs make up an era. So we have an eon can be divided into epochs, can be divided into eras. No, okay, that's wrong. We have an eon makes an era, goes down to an epoch. Okay. So, for example, if we take a look in on this graph, we have the epoch of the Paleocene, and there's some events that happen. Okay, so what is it that the events that occurred in the Earth's past will occur in the future? Not necessarily. The PETM was the last rapid warming event on Earth. By exploring what happened then, we can get an idea about what happened to our Earth today and if it continues to get warmer. Seems about accurate. The PETM represents a period of cooling. That's not true. The events that took place during the PTM have a lasting impact. Potentially, but I think that's the best answer here. Cool. So 56 million years ago. I'm going to go ahead and mark that on my notes. All right, so when and what? In this lesson, we'll look at the PETM as it was analogous time to our current era, since it was also associated with the rapid warming climate. But first, we have to ask ourselves, is it reasonable to compare the present to this time period? What was the Earth like during the PETM? Look at the world of the Paleocene, Eocene. How similar would you say it is to today's world? Okay, so you can take a look. Have you ever been in an environment such as this? They have like long, it kind of looks like a tapir, whatever. Got a little monkey dude. Got something that looks like a crocodile. There's a river. This looks like ginkgo, which is one of the oldest trees, so that seems to make sense. Yeah, I don't know. You can take a stab at how likely, very much somewhere in the middle. Okay. So we can look at and zoom into the temperature trends across time. How did temperature change during the Paleocene and Eocene? In the modern world, we construct ancient temperatures. This is done through ice cores, tree rings, and a variety of growths and patterns that reflect the temperature. We can look at other geologic, chemical, and biological materials to understand temperature trends. These events took place millions of years into the past. In doing so, we've reconstructed a global average surface temperature to curve through the Cenozoic era. This is the time period since the dinosaurs went extinct. Okay, so I'm going to put that on my graph and make a note of that in my notes, that we reconstruct temperature data using ice core, tree rings, and variety of growth patterns. Yeah, and I'll show you this on Friday too, but this, if you just look up a picture of the different eras and epochs and eons. So we have eon being the biggest one. All right, so we're here in the more recent Cenozoic era, Paleogene, whatever. Right on there is the last big warming event when it warmed 5 to 8 degrees. Okay, so back to the lesson. Geological formations, chemical signatures, and remains of organisms like those seen above can be used as proxies. What in the world's a proxy? It's a value or figure that is used to represent something else. So we look at things like ice cores as a proxy. How many bubbles were present? We can use that to compare to bubbles present in temperatures that we know of. Same thing with tree rings. What do you think would happen if it's warmer and the rate of growth of a tree? Would it be more or less? Maybe more. And so, but that obviously can correlate with a temperature. So that's how we use it as a proxy. All right, so temperature trends across time. From the Paleocene to the Eocene, what do you notice? Let's add this to our observations. So we're going to write what we notice. So I'm going to say from 59 million MYA, million years ago, to 51 million years ago, there is an increase in temperature. And then I want to be even more specific and say by how much. So I'm going from about 22, and if this is by fives, that would be about 27. So about 5 degrees. 5 degrees. And then we can measure temperature a couple different ways, and this is in degrees Celsius. Since then, there is a general negative trend, or you might say a decrease in temperature. And maybe you want to add in some more, as much information as you can type in here is awesome. So to the current temperature, which is, what do you say, about 12 degrees C? There we go. Add that to my observations, and I'll use that in my Blue Planet report later on. Okay, so what is the general surface temperature trend from the late Paleocene, about 59 million years ago, to the early Eocene, which was about 51 million years ago? So we can say that's increasing because we just looked at the graph. What was the average global surface temperature at 59 million years ago? So you could round there. I'm going to say, wait, what did it say here? 59, so we look for 59 million years on the x-axis, follow that up to this point, and then if we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, each one of these lines is 1 degree. So 1, 2, 3, go over, I would say that's about 23. What was the average global surface temperature 51 million years ago? Okay, so here we're at 25, 26, 27. Next. All right, and they estimated it a little bit different. They said 24 to 28 over the course of 8 million years. All right, last question here. What was the rate of temperature change during this time period? To find the rate, divide the temperature change by 8 million years, then multiply by 100. Enter the number as a decimal. So I'm going to go over, so the temperature change from 24 to 28 is 4 degrees. 4 divided by 8 million times 100. And you guys know you can just find the calculator. So I'm going to do 4 divided by 8 million. How do you get to a million? 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. That's 1,000, million, 8 million. And then I'm going to multiply that by 100 to get a percentage. So 0.00005. Go ahead and enter that here. 0.00005. Oh, not percentage, sorry. The reason we multiplied by 100 was because it's per century. And that's a century is 100 years. Okay, cool. All right, so how did the temperature change during the Paleocene and Eocene? Now that you have an idea of what change was like well before and after the PETM, let's take a moment to specifically look at the time around the PETM, the highest temperature on the graph below. The graph shows the data gathered about the temperature of the deep seas during the time. Deep sea data are used as another data set to compare to surface data. If both agree, it presents a stronger case for the global trend. That makes enough sense. If you see it in the ocean and on land, you can say it's more likely to have happened all over the globe. So let's use this graph to answer the question below. PETM temperature change. All right. We can do this one of two ways. Let's answer the questions first, and then we'll add it to our observations. What was the average deep sea temperature before the PETM? So remember, the PETM happened at this highest point there. That's the PETM. So before, I would say it averaged around 8. I think they just want you to estimate. What was the deep sea temperature at the peak of the PETM? Round to the nearest degree. So I would say between 12 and 14, but higher to 14. So 13.8 maybe. Our answer is too low. 14? Okay. I was being too exact. Okay, so over 60,000 years, we had an increase from 8 to 14 degrees C. What was the rate of temperature change during this time period? Okay, so we know how to do the rate. Again, that's the temperature change over the number of years, and then if we're doing it per century, we multiply by 1,000. So how many degrees are difference between 8 and 14? That would be 6. So here we're going 6 over not 8,000, 8 million, but we have 60,000. 6, 0, 0, 0, 0. That answer times 100. 0.005. Let's go ahead and enter that. Okay, make sure to clear your calculator. That's embarrassing. So to do it again, we have 6 divided by 60123 times 100 equals 0.01. Awesome. All right, so now let's go ahead and answer how those ancient temperatures compare to now. Oh, wait, go back and make sure you have entered this, add this observation. So the rate of increase during the PETM was 0.01 degrees per century, peaking at 14 in 14 degrees C, no naked numbers, 55 million years ago. Yeah. And I say, and the average was 8 degrees C. Okay, good. So every time we add those observations, that's useful in our blue planet report. We're going to need to use those later, so you can see them piling up over here. And all the more detail you add now is going to help you out when you're going to write your final report. Okay, on to the next one. Here we go, let's compare. How does the change in global average temperature today compare to the historical examples of global average temperatures change? And for this, you're going to want to look at this graph down here. And we crunched all these numbers, but they wrote them back out for us. Which one of these is the largest number? We have 0.8 degrees per century. That's today's temperature trend. Is that faster a rate or slower a rate? That would be faster. And we already have this added, but I guess if you didn't, you could add it. Next. Says that's correct. The temperature change we are witnessing today is much faster than both the background temperature change and during the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, the fastest previous change recorded during the Cenozoic. All right, cool. We get to select and choose our own adventure. We'll explore several ancient biomes through their fossils. This will help to understand how they changed during the PETM and think about what that means for a world with more rapid warming. So do you want to look at forests, insects, or coral reefs? And I think we'll probably check all three. So let's just start at the beginning. Forests. How did forests change during the PETM? In this section, we'll explore what happened to the forest ecosystems. We will look at the forest ecosystems during the PETM through fossil leaves. These fossils preserve a snapshot of forest life over millions of years through drastic temperature changes. Through studying these fossil leaves, we should be able to get a better idea of how the rapid warming that occurred during the PETM affected the types of plants that could thrive at the time. Forest ecosystems are an agglomeration of various plants. That's your vocab word for the day. It's kind of random. Agglomeration, to glom together, like building up of various species. Fungal and animal, they coexist together, but how do they respond to change? Do they adapt or do they fall apart? And here this says, plants that form tree structures are relatively recent, emerging only 385 million years ago, which represents only 8% of Earth history. Okay. So how did the forest change? We're going to look specifically at the shape of leaves to determine whether the climate is temperate or tropical. This technique is known as leaf margin analysis. Oh, this is really cool. So you can also go and I did a little video lesson on cactus and tropicals, but the difference between tropical plants and cactus plants, or desert plants, at this plant store. So you can link to that on the Wonderment if you are curious. But let's take a look at how they look at the leaves. For temperate climates, they have toothed leaves. The increased surface area allows for more evaporation, which increases flow of water through the plant and allows the plant to start photosynthesis earlier in the growing season. So take a second to dissect that. So more surface area allows for more evaporation, which allows the plant to do more photosynthesis because more water is coming through. Remember, what is water used for during photosynthesis? If you want to get into the details, the sun blasts apart a water molecule, releasing an electron, which binds together with carbon dioxide to be super simplified, helps form a glucose molecule. Okay, so we do need water for photosynthesis. But in smooth leaves, which are more common in tropical areas, like those near the equator, less surface area, which means that less water is lost. All right, so now we're gonna zoom in on the Bighorn Basin. This is a reconstruction of the world as it would have been around the time of the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. We will be exploring Bighorn Basin in Wyoming, at a location that has preserved fossil leaves across the PETM boundary. You will explore fossil assemblages in the following order. From the late Paleocene, 56.2 million years ago, to the PETM, 55.9 million years ago, and the early Eocene, 55.4 million years ago. Alright, so we're going to explore the flora present at the Bighorn Basin during the Paleocene. Select all of the fossil leaves at this right that are tropical, or smooth, margined at this time. Okay, need help? Oh, that's what we just learned. Okay, so go ahead and take a look. Which one of these look like they have smooth leaves? Okay, so if you select these three, notice how you're just looking at the ridge overall, and these are all jagged. So we got 3 out of 6, so it's about 50%. Equal amount smooth and toothed, indicating a temperate climate. Okay. So now let's look at the PETM fossils. Again, we're selecting the smooth margined. This one, that one. Yeah, it looks like all of them are smooth-leaved, indicating a tropical climate. Okay, and then let's look at how that affected afterwards during the Eocene. Smooth. That's correct. All right, so and then it goes back to being a cooler temperate climate, and we see the leaves, the trees adapt to that new climate. According to the data you collected, you may notice fewer plants with toothed leaves during the PETM. Given the warmer temperatures during that time, plants with toothed leaves, which are well suited for temperate climates, migrate to cooler temperatures near the Earth's poles. What was happening to the forest ecosystem during this interval? So you'll notice here, if we look at this data set, temperate leaves equal, and then temperate leaves replaced potentially by tropical leaves. So let's find that. Temperate adapted plants were temporarily replaced by tropical adapted plants. Great job. By exploring how the flora changes from the Paleocene through the Eocene during a significant temperature spike, we have discovered that the temperate adapted flora is temporarily replaced by tropical flora before returning to the Bighorn Basin once the temperatures decreased. The rate of temperature change during the PETM was 0.01 degrees Celsius per century. What conclusion best matches the observations you made? Use the table below to gather more information. All right, so let's take a look at this table. Here we have a bunch of different types of plants. That ginkgo is one that I noticed in the picture. And maybe you want to take a look at what those look like. But you can see that there are 2 that only exist during the PETM. Otherwise, you have these other ones that exist before and after. So my guess is those 2 are the tropical plants. Let's see which one of these responses, and I think yours might be in different orders, but I'm going to read just the order that came up for me. The rate of the temperature change exceeded the ecosystem's ability to adapt driving certain species of plants to extinction. It could be true. The rate of the temperature change was slow enough that certain species could migrate without losing significant numbers, then return once the temperatures cooled. That potentially could happen because we do notice that they come back. They didn't go fully extinct, otherwise we wouldn't see them back in the Eocene. The change in temperature had no effect on the species, well, we can see that it did, and the increase in temperature during the PTM drove 4 plant species to extinction. And again, they came back, so that's not the best answer. Yeah, so they didn't go extinct, but they moved away from the area and then returned when the conditions improved. That means that temperature changes were slow enough that species were able to cope by moving somewhere else. Given the rate of temperature change is 0.8 degrees per century, determine all of the possible inferences, or using our prior knowledge and guesses based on observations, we can draw from our PETM study. Forests will not change that much. Forests will migrate slowly towards cooler climates, or forest ecosystems may fall apart with species going extinct. Well, okay, so we do know forests probably will change, but given that this is a faster rate than we've ever seen before, we might say one or the two of these following options. Forests will migrate slowly towards cooler climates, and that would happen if it was similar to what we've seen in the past. But since it's faster, the ecosystem may fall apart with species going extinct. That's another possibility. And here it says we are likely to draw the conclusion that because the rate of change now is faster than during the PTM, that the outcome will be worse. However, we don't know this for sure because we don't know the thresholds that determine whether an ecosystem moves or collapses. Therefore, we must also draw the conclusion that we will see a replication of the PETM events. So how did forests change during the PETM? All right, so how did forests change? Here we have a picture of the biota of the Paleocene, Eocene thermal maximums 56 million years ago. Results from Bighorn Basin mirror what we see elsewhere in the world during the spike in temperatures during the PETM. We see few extinctions of plant species, but their distribution changes. Temperate adapted species retreat into the mountains and towards the poles, while tropical adapted species expand away from the tropics and replace the temperate adapted species. That makes sense, right? In the current warming scenario, we can expect to see similar results, but the rate of the change is so dramatically higher that the slow, stable movement that we observed during the PETM that it might not be possible. Ecosystems may exceed their change thresholds and die before they can shift, leading to mass extinctions. Let's go back and real quick, you want to add that to your observation. So we are, here we go. Oh, we did that. All right. So I'm going to add this one to my observation, and I'm going to write something along those lines. Temperate species move towards the poles, and tropical species adapt during the PETM event forming. Okay. And please be more specific than that if that helps you for the next round. All right, so let's explore into insect herbivory. How do insect herbivory change? So that's basically insects eating herbs, plants. In this section, we will look at how changes in climate over a period of time can affect biology. We will look at the feeding behavior of insects. Many insects feed on plant leaves, and some plant leaf fossils show evidence of this feeding, called insect herbivory. I'm going to write that word down because I've never heard that word before, maybe. Well, I have, but maybe you have not. By looking at how insect behavior has changed in the Paleocene through the PETM and into the Eocene, it allows us to get a better idea of what changes might be in store for our planet as it continues to warm. So go ahead and take a look at those pictures and see what you see. Here we see we can explore insect behavior by investigating fossil leaves and how insects have damaged them over time. And there's a couple examples. Have you guys ever seen these? These are really neat. Like, Go out on a hike and see if you can see these galls or these traces of leaf cutter, leaves being cut into. There's a reconstruction of the world as it was at the time of the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. We will explore Bighorn Basin in Wyoming, same place, and we'll look at that boundary. All right, so here we go. Let's look first at the Paleocene. We have the insect damage and non-damage. And now we want to estimate the percentage of leaves damaged by the insect. And so you can take a look how might you estimate the percentage there? Maybe if you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 inches, I'm assuming. Okay, so maybe in all of those samples, wow, hard to estimate maybe, but you'd say somewhere between 20 and 30? I'm just gonna say 20. Less than the actual amount. Okay, so let's try 30. Okay, to find the percentage of leaf samples that suffered insect damage, first count up the number of leaves that had suffered insect damage. Once you have this number, divide it by the total number of leaves. Oh, okay. Okay, that's easier. I thought they meant within each one of the leaves. So we have 1, 2, 3 leaves out of a total of 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So 3 out of 10, which is 30%. All right, and then let's do the same thing for the PETM. We have insect damage 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 out of 10, 60%. And finally, back to the Eocene, we got 3 out of 10 again, back to 30%. All right, so how did insect herbivory change? Leaf consumption by insects temporarily increased if we went 30 to 60 to 30. Given that the rate of the temperature change is 0.8 degrees C per century compared to 0.01 during the PTM, determine all of the possible inferences. So we probably will see an increase and probably maybe more so because we have a larger increase now and faster rate of warming. All right, so let's add this observation in. Here we go. During the transition from the Paleocene to the Eocene, the world saw a spike in temperatures. In this time period, we observe a great increase in insect damage to plant leaves, as well as a diverse type of damage. Why do we see this? Plants need CO2 to grow. With more CO2, they can grow faster and bigger. However, plants are still nitrogen limited. These faster growing plants are less nutritious because although they have a lot of carbon, they still have the same amount of nitrogen. As a result, insects tend to eat more of the plant to get the same level of nitrogen. All right, that's pretty interesting. So same carbon, less nitrogen if the plant's less healthy, then the insect needs the same amount of nitrogen, so it eats more. And I'm writing those in my notes. It eats more. Okay, on a warming planet like we see today, we would expect to see an increasing amount of insect damage, not just to native ecosystems, but also to our crops. Okay. Let's go ahead and add that observation in. So insect herbivory increases during warming events, PETM in particular, because more CO2 means greater plant growth with less nitrogen. Insects eat more of the plant than to get their nitrogen fix. Add. Alrighty. And our final thing, we did insect damage, forest ecosystems, and let's go into coral reefs. What happened to the coral reefs? So we already saw what is happening today. Can events during the PETM give us an insight as to their ultimate fate? Coral reefs today are constructed by tiny animals called scleracean corals. Historically, though, that was not always the case. Although reef structures are common throughout the Phanerozoic, the organisms that build them change over time. In the past, reefs were built by sponges, bryozoans, crinoids, and rugose corals, which were in the Paleozoic, and rudists in the Mesozoic. Some of these organisms still exist in rare locations, while others have gone extinct. And so we're going to reconstruct what happened in the past at these coral sites, these places that have coral reefs. And here we go, same time periods that we're working with. So we're going to explore each of these locations, and we're going to look at use the map to determine whether coral algal reefs made from corals and algae or giant forams, shelled animals, are present. Use the reference map at the bottom of the right to see what each looks like. Okay, so we could reference that down here. Okay, here's what a coral algal reef looks like, and that's what a giant foram looks like. It's kind of a type of shelled protist. Notice those different life forms. And I actually have one of these coral algal rocks. They're really neat to look at. All those little markings. All right, so number 1. That looks like a coral algal to me. Okay. Number 2. Same. Number 3. Use your skills there to fill that one in. Number 4. Same old, same old. And number 5. Whoa, something different. And notice how, what's different about Site 5 as well? It's maybe a little further south, but there we got that foram dominated. Okay, so most Paleocene healthy reefs had coral algal reefs. Now, let's look at what happens during the PETM. Let's look at it again. Okay, I'm just going to click through and then we're going to go down below and do it. Site 1 and 2. Oh, now I see Site 3 has changed. Site 4 has changed. And Site 5 has changed. There we go. So I'm going to do coral algal, foram, foram, foram. Next. All right, and let's look finally at the Eocene. Oh, hey-oh, we got some foram. Oh my gosh, what if we're all replaced and there's no more? I think that might be the case. All right, so this is different trend than we've seen in our other ecosystems that we've looked at. Whereas during the Eocene, it readapted. It looks like the coral reef maybe doesn't adapt in the same way. What was happening during the reefs at this time? Looks like coral algal reefs collapsed as a result and did not recover afterwards. Okay, so given that we know that, what do you expect would happen? That's my guess. All right, so what happened? All right, so we'll read this. In addition to the beauty and tourist potential, coral reefs are hugely important. Coral reefs create a buffer for the coast against storms and as nurseries for huge populations of fish that depend on for food. The coral reef system during the PETM survived the impact that killed the dinosaurs. The coral reef ecosystem eventually collapsed and did not return. When reef systems eventually did return, many tens of millions of years later, they were built by different groups of organisms. These modern organisms form the reefs we see today, but for how much longer? Okay, so I'm going to add that coral reefs did not changed and did not recover due to the PETM. Alright, so I've checked all 3. We've done it. Well, we did do it. I don't know what that's saying. Let's go, finally, here. And review. And in conclusion, the consequences of a warming world. All has happened before and potentially can happen again. Earth has experienced periods of sudden warming throughout the history. In this investigation, we looked at the consequences of this warming and saw forest ecosystems migrated but did not suffer mass extinctions. Insect herbivory increased markedly, and coral reefs disappeared and did not return. And I have all of that now in my notes. Other consequences that were not observed. And I'm going to take notes on this too. Great things to talk about in your DBA. Mammals shrank due to heat stress. Ocean acidity increased. And this is actually cool. If you did the experiment, you can see that if you increase acid, like putting vinegar on an egg, you're going to dissolve the shell, which is basically the same thing that these animals in the ocean are made of. More intense storms lead to erosion, and when the soil erodes, that makes the soil less fertile, able to grow crops, which is what humans ultimately care about if we are wanting to feed ourselves. And here, rainfall became more variable and resulted in more frequent flooding and drought. Just giving a minute to write that down. All right, so in conclusion, we explore geologic history to understand our potential histories. History often repeats itself. Patterns of the past can give us clues to the patterns of the future. The PETM shows a world that was severely affected by a 5 to 8 degrees C global average temperature rise. The temperature rise was slow enough to allow many ecosystems to adjust. However, some ecosystems were pushed past their breaking point and never recovered, even after the planet cooled down. We are seeing similar patterns unfolding now, but at 100 times the speed, from 0.01 to 0.08, or to 0.8, right, the PTM. Compared to the PTM can give us the insight into what is likely to happen, but the other comparison is limited because no other warming event on Earth has ever unfolded so quickly. Do you think the current global warming trend is a problem? Why or why not? And I'll go ahead and let you respond to that, and you can pause the video there to respond. Putting it all together, how does the PTM relate to today? So during the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, when global surface temperatures spiked, we observed temperate forests. They temporarily migrated towards the poles. Insect herbivory temporarily increased, and coral reefs permanently or collapsed. Here we go. Of temperature change was slower than today, meaning that these historical events likely underestimate the impact of today's increasing temperature. Insights from an ancient world. The cause of the PTM temperature spike is unknown. However, a variety of geochemical evidence suggests that a sudden uptick in the atmospheric CO2 or CH4, and that's carbon dioxide and methane, was likely the reason. The cause of this atmospheric carbon increase is not known. Atmospheric carbon changes aren't the only way to change global temperatures, however. In addition to the 11-year cycle, the sun is slowly growing brighter on a billion-year timescale, resulting in a slow warming of the planet over its lifetime. Orbital changes. So yeah, we're actually at the end of the 11-year cycle, which is actually decreasing the amount of radiance, so we should be getting colder anyway. Orbital changes due to perturbations or perturbation is something that has an effect on something else. by Jupiter and Saturn operating on 1,000 to million year timescales have resulted in the periodicity, or something that happens in a schedule or a period, of glaciation in the recent past. Let's think about that. Orbital changes due to perturbations by Jupiter and Saturn. Okay, so maybe that because of the influence of Jupiter and Saturn, that has caused some glaciation or increasing glaciers. Hazes, aerosols, and the presence or absence of ice, and even continental arrangement can all affect how much sunlight is reflected back into space, changing Earth's albedo. And remember, albedo is the measure of amount of sun reflected back, sun's lights, rays, something like snow on a mountain has high albedo. And if we have, there's something in aerosols called CFCs that decreases the decreases the layer in the atmosphere so that more sunlight can come in. And then other greenhouse gases can also change Earth's atmosphere and temperature and trigger cascading effects. So the question is, what is causing the very rapid warming trend that we are seeing today? We are certain that we'll have grave consequences based on what we see in the geological record. If we can understand the cause of this trend, then we can try to control it. All right, and we're done. We've finished the lesson. Good job, and that took about an hour. Hopefully I have some notes. I'll show you some of my notes, and we can move on to the next lesson, which is this lesson on finding the causes, and that's the natural progression.